Bueno, hoy tenemos el honor de recibir a una personalidad dentro del mundo shakespeariano que se ha destacado desde hace mucho tiempo ya por los libros que ha escrito. Tengo un breve resumen de su carrera que se los voy a decir y después ya nos metemos de lleno hoy en dos libros principalmente, 1599 y 1606, y un poquito en un libro muy interesante que escribió contestando a la teoría de que Shakespeare no era Shakespeare, sino el Earl of Oxford o Bacon o el que cada uno se imaginaba, que se llama Contested Will. En principio lo que le quería preguntar era ¿cuántos de ustedes han leído algún libro de James? Ahí estamos. Bueno, those are the books
I know,
you sold. So it's like...
It's good.
Right. Los trajeron como para que se los firme. Bueno, después vamos a arreglar eso. Vamos a hacer un corte a las 3 de la tarde, que le pido a la cabina que haga así un flash de luces, algo, para que pueda saber bien el horario. Un corte de 10 minutos. Y en los últimos 15 minutos vamos a abrirlo para preguntas. Y después James, con todo gusto, en el hall, les va a firmar todos los libros. Vamos a tener que desalojar un poco rápido la sala porque a las 5 de la tarde estamos con la obra Anthony Unbound, en la que actúan George, que está por ahí, y Penny Charles, que está ahí. Ella es la directora. Ella es la directora. Yeah. A little pressure, just a little. Shapiro es profesor de inglés y literatura comparada en la Universidad de Columbia. En esa universidad es miembro desde el año 85. Se especializó en la enseñanza de Shakespeare y ha publicado una extensa variedad de trabajos relacionados con Shakespeare y la cultura isabelina. Ha recibido premios de instituciones como National Endowment for Humanities, the Huntington Library y la Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. Ha escrito innumerable cantidad de artículos para The New York Times, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, The Financial Times, The Daily Telegraph. En el año 2006 ganó el premio Samuel Johnson y el premio Theatre Book Prize por su libro 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare. En ese mismo año fue nombrado miembro de la John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, that's a long name, y miembro del Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers en la Biblioteca Pública de Nueva York. En el año 2011 ganó el premio George Friedley Memorial, entregado por la Theatre Library Association con su libro Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare, que ha sido descrito como la mejor respuesta a la teoría de que Shakespeare no era Shakespeare. Ese mismo año, en el 2011, Shapiro es nombrado miembro de la American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Actualmente es miembro del board de la Royal Shakespeare Company, de la Folger Library en Washington, y trabaja como consultor para el Public Theater en New York y es a la vez vicepresidente del Sindicato de Autores de Estados Unidos. Algunos de los títulos que ha publicado son Rival Playwrights, Marlowe, Johnson y Shakespeare, Shakespeare and the Jews, 1599, Contested Will, Shakespeare in America y 1606, entre otros. Ha protagonizado una miniserie de 3 episodios, un documental que es súper interesante, hecho para la BBC4, llamado The King and the Playwright, A Jacobean History, sobre Shakespeare y la era jacobina. El que lo pueda enganchar por YouTube, la verdad no se lo pierda. Está casado con Mary, que también está por ahí en la sala, que también es escritora, y es padre de Luke, que está haciendo sus primeros pasos como actor en Nueva York. Right? Is that okay?
Sí.
Well, no dijo una palabra y ya nos humilló a todos. Así que yo dejo el cuestionario y me voy. No, en principio, bueno, nada, gracias por estar acá, por el viaje que has hecho. Es un año bastante cargado de trabajo y está así como de gira siguiendo a los Rolling Stones. Ya pasaron, ahora viene él y va siguiendo el tour de los Rolling Stones. El Mick Jagger de Shakespeare. Pero en principio, para meternos de lleno en 1599, why did you choose this year? Basically, that's the first question.
My first answer before the first question is thank you all for coming out to be here at this event. Thank you for Patricio for the extraordinary generosity and hospitality. And thank you also members of the British Council and the Romeo Foundation for making it possible for me to come to this beautiful city in this extraordinary country. It's my first time down here and not my last. So I'm very happy to be here. And now I'll start answering those hard questions. Don't abandon me. Why did I choose 1599?
Yeah.
For some people, Shakespeare is a poet. For others, he's the subject of scholarly analysis. For me, Shakespeare is first and foremost a man of the theater. And in 1599, he was a pretty desperate man of the theater because his theater company had lost its lease and they were homeless.
Yeah.
And without a permanent theater, you can't do, if you are Shakespeare, what you want to do. So I knew that in 1599, the Globe Theater was built. And maybe we can get back to that. But I chose 1599 because it was also, after the Globe Theater was built, an extraordinarily creative year for Shakespeare. He finished Henry V. He wrote Julius Caesar and As You Like It. And he started Hamlet. And that is about as good a year as any writer could hope for. So I thought two things. One, what would it be like to immerse myself in 1 year? Read everything that was written. Read everything that was described by historians. Read as many manuscripts. Visit as many places as I could. And try to immerse myself fully in 1 year. What I didn't know when I started this was that it would take 15 years to research and write. I was very young when I started
Your kid was born.
Right,
Yeah.
It was true. I was a bachelor when I started, and I had a child when I was done. So that's how long it was. The other problem is this. If you want to write about Shakespeare's life, you have two choices. One is to begin at the cradle and end at the grave. And the other is to choose, like a salami slice, a slice of the life. And as tempting as it is to write about Shakespeare in the cradle and Shakespeare in the grave, we just don't know anything about Shakespeare from the time he was in his late teens.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah.
What do you know of how he became an actor, or how he moved from Stratford to London?
What we know about Shakespeare is that at the age of 18, he married a woman who was 26, Anne Hathaway. And most people think everyone in Shakespeare's day married at 14 or 13, or my students sometimes say 8 or 9, and I have to stop them there. People married in Shakespeare's day at 24 or 25, men and women. So he was a little young. His wife was in the right age group. He was very young to marry. And they married. She was already pregnant. And they had a child, Susanna. And 2 years later, they had twins, Hamlet and Judith. And that's all we know about Shakespeare from that moment until a decade later, or 7 or 8 years later, he emerges in London as a playwright. Now, if you're a biographer, the absolute blank slate either is enormously attractive or terrifying. It's attractive because if you want, you can make stuff up. In other words, Shakespeare had a religious crisis. He was Catholic and then became Protestant. Shakespeare had
He traveled around Europe.
He traveled around Europe. He made it to Buenos Aires and back just in time. He slept with girls. He slept with boys. He slept with boys and girls in any combination you want. And because there's nobody who can contradict this,
Yeah.
that's what biographers do. Sexual crisis, religious crisis, professional crisis. The truth is, we don't know. I don't know.
There's a theater company that visited Stratford, and maybe he joined that company.
It's a great story.
It's a great story.
There was a theater company, the Queen's Men, the best theater company in the country, touring around. And as actors will do, they fight with each other, and one killed another. So there was an opening. So maybe Shakespeare joined the Queen's Men and went to London with them. That could be. This year, there's a new biography out that argues that Shakespeare went to London because his father was a wool merchant, and he was protecting his father's business interests and representing him in London.
Could be.
Anything could be. And because of that, I said, I can't do this. I can't write fiction. I'll stick with what we know. What was Shakespeare doing when we know he was in London and a member of a theater company, working at a particular theater at a particular time, writing particular plays? And that is the kind of cultural history that I'm very comfortable writing.
Right. And but you started in 1599, and how can you describe the relationship between the Queen and the theater, the Queen and the actors and the playwrights?
Queen Elizabeth had been queen in England from 1558. Shakespeare was born 6 years later in 1564. That meant this was the only ruler he ever knew. Imagine here in Argentina, one ruler is all you ever knew. I mean,
We can't imagine that.
No, I know.
We have like 5 presidents in a week, you know, it's like...
So, having Queen Elizabeth as queen for Shakespeare as a young playwright was a good thing and a bad thing. The bad thing was she wasn't very generous to actors and playwrights. She would bring them to court to play 2 or 3 times a year and give them a minor amount, just 10 pounds or so, which was not a lot of money for a performance. But at least they were tolerated. What was good about having Queen Elizabeth on the throne was she was old and she was childless, and she said no one could talk about who would rule in England after her. This was great for Shakespeare because everybody was anxious about who would be the next ruler. And at this time, there are no newspapers, there's no radio. Theaters were where people went to understand their world, their religious world, their economic world, their political world, what their hopes were, what their dreams were. Shakespeare understood this, and he understood that one of the anxieties his fellow Londoners and Englishmen faced was, what's going to happen when she dies? In play after play, Titus Andronicus, Henry VI Part 1, Henry VI Part 2, Henry VI Part 3, Richard III, King John, up through Hamlet, he's writing plays about succession. The king is dead, or the queen is dead. Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V. Who is going to rule when a ruler dies? And Shakespeare, really, for the first half of his career, understood that people needed to see that story told in many ways, and told it brilliantly. So for me, that is the main relationship. Did Queen Elizabeth know Shakespeare and support him? She knew he was a writer, but writers were not very prestigious members of society. A generation earlier, they were considered vagabonds. So they were rising in status, but not at a very high level
Right.
under
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, and what about the Chamberlains Men? Because they had they had two of the best actors
They-
of the time,
Shakespeare
Kemp and Burbage.
And Burbage. Shakespeare was very lucky to join a group of 6 other very talented theater artists in 1594. They got together and they called themselves the Chamberlains Men. And they called themselves the Chamberlains Men because everybody needed a bit of protection. And they used an aristocrat, Lord Chamberlain, to support them. He gave their name and a little bit of protection, but not much more. We think of artists sitting in a room somewhere scribbling. Shakespeare did sit in a room and scribble, but he was also, as terrible as it sounds, Shakespeare was also an entrepreneur and a businessman. And he knew that in order to write, he had to sell tickets and fill a theater. And his fellow shareholders knew that. To be a member of the Chamberlains Men meant investing the equivalent of 70,000 US dollars, each one of them, put forward the capital to create a company for props and buy plays and hire other actors.
Yeah.
It was financially risky. And this was the business world Shakespeare entered and remained in for 20 years. The advantage of this company was they had the best tragic actor in the country, Richard Burbage, and they had the funniest man in the country, Will Kemp. And they had the greatest playwright in the country. So they were a very, very strong company. And there are always tensions between leading actors, you know this, you produced, directed, and have acted. And there's a wonderful story about Shakespeare and Will Kemp. I'm sorry, Shakespeare and Richard Burbage that was written down by a law student in 1602 named Manningham. Manningham wrote in his diary, and I'll paraphrase in modern English, although I can still remember the Elizabethan English. They were putting on Richard III, and Burbage was a brilliant Richard III. And he was very charismatic, even though he was hunchbacked and deformed, he was sexy, and he was hot, and he was young. So a woman in the audience passed him a note saying, "Could you come to my place after the performance?" And she said, "Don't come as yourself, come as Richard III." Shakespeare overheard this exchange, and he went to her house, and he was upstairs doing his business with her when there's a knock on the door, and it's Burbage downstairs ready to have an affair with this woman. And Shakespeare called out, "William the Conqueror comes before Richard III." So I didn't make this up. It's one of those lovely stories. And it tells you that even then, playwrights and actors thought, I'm more important, you're more important.
And the tension between Burbage and Kemp as well, because Kemp was like, he was the man. Yeah. With the jigs. Can you talk about that,
Kemp,
the jigs?
The other thing that's strange, I'll talk about the jigs. Will Kemp thought that Shakespeare was secondary, and he is the funniest man in England, and also charismatic, was the person playgoers came to see.
Yeah.
So there was a falling out between Shakespeare and Kemp. Kemp, like a lot of rock and roll stars, thought, I'm going to leave the group and go solo, and I'll be bigger than all of them. And everybody who stayed with Shakespeare's group died a rich man. Kemp died a poor man a few years later. And you would think that rock and roll stars who went solo would have learned from this experience.
No.
But they did not. But imagine one of the differences between Shakespeare's theater today and Shakespeare's theater back then was until 1599, when this stopped. After the play was over and Romeo and Juliet are lying dead and you're crying, two men and two boys would come out, the boys dressed as women, and the men, one of whom was Kemp, would sing a bawdy song and grab their crotches and do something obscene. And audiences loved this. And it was called a jig. And we know about the jigs because years later, they were so popular with other companies, not Shakespeare's, that people would wait till the show was over and then push in to see the jig. They didn't want to see the play, they wanted the bawdy jig. Shakespeare clearly did not want this after his great tragedies. And by the time he wrote Julius Caesar, the jig was over. But it was a very different world back then, in some respects, but in other respects, the way that theater spoke to the nation, it's really quite the same.
And his company, they were based in the theater called The Theater, right?
They were based in...
But they had to move.
They rented a theater called The Theater. When Shakespeare was born in 1564, there were no permanent playhouses in England. Shakespeare could not have guessed as a 10-year-old boy that he would one day become a playwright and an actor in a permanent theater outdoors that could hold 3,000 playgoers. In 1576, an entrepreneurial businessman built a theater called The Theater in London's northern suburbs. And a year later, another one called The Curtain was built right near each other. Like shoe stores or leather shops, one goes up, the next goes up right next door to bring business. And that made it possible for the first time in England, if you were a writer, to make a living as a writer without getting the handout from somebody rich. You could make a penny from everybody in the audience, more from those who wanted to sit in better seats, and you could thrive. The problem was, at the end of the day, the box office, the take, would have to be divided half to the landlord, half to the Chamberlains Men. And we actually now know, because of the archaeology of Shakespeare's theater, how the money was even collected. There was a little clay jar with just a wide enough opening to drop a penny or a shilling in the top. Nobody trusted anyone else then, unlike today. And after all the playgoers went home, they would smash the clay and divide up the change, the pennies. And Shakespeare's company felt, why are we giving the landlord half the money? And the landlord thought, I can do better than have a theater company in here. And he pulled a lease. So in 1599, they rented land near where the New Globe Theater now stands. And during Christmas, when they knew that their landlord was home for the holidays, they came to the theater. The Theater is the name of that building. And they took all the props, probably out of the Curtain where they were playing at the time. The halberds, the swords.
And they had weapons.
They had real weapons, serious weapons. And they came, and they brought 12 carpenters with them. And friends of the theater owner said, hey, what are you doing? And they said, get out of the way and you won't get hurt. We know this because there was a lawsuit and all the evidence came out. And the carpenters on this cold December day dismantled the theater. And they packed it up and they stored it and they sent it across the Thames when the weather was better. And out of that same timber, they rebuilt the Globe Theater in the same dimensions out of the materials that were standing in the theater. And that was, they tried to save money by using straw or thatch on the roof rather than tiles. Had they spent a little bit more money, it would have been wiser, because 14 years later, during a production of Henry VIII, they fired a gun, it caught the thatch on fire, and the whole theater burned down in an hour. Luckily, no one was hurt, and they saved the manuscripts and the costumes. But they had to rebuild the Globe in that year.
So the myth that they walked through the frozen river, it's like,
you know,
they had the bridge.
the bridge was expensive. There was a toll on the bridge, and the river was frozen, but this was extremely valuable timber. There was no more timber to be had in and around oak, in and around London in this year. One of the things that I do is research every small thing, including where did the wood come from? They would bring in Baltic fir from Russia. They would ship it over because they ran out of oak in London. So they had enough. It was 700 pounds of timber to rebuild the globe. But when it burned down, they had to use Baltic fir.
Yeah. What can you tell us about South Bank then? Because there were shows with bears and wild dogs.
Yeah.
Many pubs, prostitutes. It was like, you know.
There was a walled city of London. And inside the walled city of London, the Lord Mayor and the aldermen ruled. And they were puritanical. They didn't like actors and theaters because that's riffraff, that's crowds, that's noise, that's violence. Apprentices would go to the theaters and try to tear them down. So the theaters were banished to the margins, or what they called the liberties of the city. And like pearls strung around in a necklace, theaters sprung up around London, on the South Bank, in the northern suburbs, and playgoers would cross the river to go to these places.
The Rose, the Swan.
The Rose, the Swan, the Red Bull, the Fortune. There were so many theaters in a community of only 200,000. It meant that people went to plays all the time. Some all the time, some not at all, some too old, some too young. But the areas where the playhouses were, like the Rose and the Globe, were places of marginal activity, prostitution, executions, sword fighting. The other main sport was bear baiting and bull baiting. They would tie a bear to a post and chain the bear by the neck to that post, and they would let savage dogs loose. Sometimes the bear would win, sometimes the dog would win. And also they would tie bulls, and this was blood sport.
There's a nice reference in Macbeth.
And I am tied to the post and must stand the course. There was one unfortunate theater entrepreneur who decided, why don't I combine a theater and a bear baiting? And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we'll bait bears, and the other days. The problem was it smelled so bad in that theater, no one wanted to go to the Hope Theater, and that was the end of the Hope.
Yeah. So they built the Globe, and they opened it with Julius Caesar.
They opened it with Julius Caesar.
Why did he choose that thing?
That's a really hard question to answer. In some ways, it's a very political and topical play. In some ways, if you looked at the outside of the Globe Theater, it almost looked like a Roman building. So it was appropriate in that way. But all the issues of the day fed through that play. The idea of regime change. There were people trying to come from Spain to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. There's a lot of concern about political assassination of a ruler. So it was a very, very rich
She had
play.
many attempts.
There had been several attempts on her life, and England was at war with Spain. There was still fear in the year 1599, in the summer of 1599, right after the Globe was built, that the Spanish, who had sent an armada in 1588, were sending yet another armada. And there was panic in the streets of London. They were chaining the streets, bonfires all night. The Spanish are coming. They're going to make us into Catholics. They're going to burn down the theaters. Shakespeare must have had a few sleepless nights. So this was a really exciting and turbulent time.
And it's divided in two. What happens first when a dictator is killed, and then it's like he was politically correct with the time, you know, because
part of the question at the heart, and that's a really good point. Part of the question at the heart of Julius Caesar is, are you allowed to get rid of a bad ruler? And that's a hard question to answer. And in the late 16th century, people were debating that. is regicide, is killing a ruler, permissible if that ruler is going to act in a tyrannical way. And Shakespeare really puts his finger on that issue in this play that people were struggling with. And again, we see Shakespeare, not we, but too many people see Shakespeare as above it all, as writing in a timeless way. He was writing in the thick of politics and historical debates and debates about all kinds of cultural issues, religion, marriage, sex, sexual identity. That's what his hands were steeped in. And the play he wrote right after Julius Caesar is As You Like It, where a young woman is dressed as a young man and in love with a young man who must woo her as a man. The whole gender-bending quality of that play speaks to the issues of what sexual identity was. The question of sexual identity wasn't invented in 1990. They're wrestling with it back then. And Shakespeare, knowing he had boy actors playing women parts, had a wonderful boy actor play Rosalind.
How did they cast the boys?
How did they cast the boys? In one way, the boys apprenticed to the actors, so they were trained in the theater. And when I say boys, the actor playing Rosalind or the actor playing Ophelia would have been a teenager, 16 or 18 years old, no beard like that coming in.
Sorry.
You would have been too old. And they were very talented at impersonating the parts of women. So it was a world in which the play changed every day. It wasn't like Cats now and forever, as we say. One day Hamlet, the next day Romeo, the next day Julius Caesar, as audiences who came back to the Globe expected to see the company change the
When
plays.
they do rehearse?
Every morning they would get up, come together, and they would have decided probably the day before what play they were going to stage that day. And they rehearsed it that morning. And I'm sorry, Penny, but there were no directors in Shakespeare's day. It was all just the actors, and they knew each other. And they knew 20 old plays and 20 new plays. They had fabulous memories. They would break for a meal, and then they would perform the play from 2 to 5 in the afternoon. And then the actors would go drink, have sex, whatever actors do today then. And Shakespeare would have to go back to his lodgings and read and write late into the night. And he worked minimum 10, 12 hours a day, every day for a quarter century. So this was hard, hard work.
In Julius Caesar, you link Brutus with Hamlet. How is that?
Well, first, Shakespeare links the two plays. When he has Polonius in Hamlet say that he played Caesar as a young man and he was killed in the Capitol. And everybody in the audience would have laughed because if not the day before, then the week before, they had seen Richard Burbage and the actor playing Polonius kill each other in the very play. So that's a bit of an in-joke. But also, it's not as if Shakespeare only had one play in his head at any moment. He was writing Julius Caesar and thinking of Hamlet. And he was writing Julius Caesar and thinking of As You Like It. And he always had something in his head that he hadn't yet committed to paper. So the plays are in conversation with each other. And certainly that helps us link chronologically these plays.
Then he staged Henry V. There would know. There were like desperate times for the audience, especially for the men, because the fight with Ireland.
One of the things that I didn't know about when I started researching this book, but I learned very quickly after marrying somebody of Irish stock, was England was in the midst of a 9 years war with Ireland. And they were afraid that Spain would invade England from a base in Ireland, and they were trying to crush an Irish rebellion. And Elizabeth did not like spending money on the theater. She definitely did not spend money on her military. There was no standing army. So every time there was a flare-up militarily in Ireland, she would send men to round up more soldiers to go to Ireland. And the situation got worse and worse in the late 1590s. And in August of 1598, an English column of troops going to relieve a garrison that was starving in Ireland was ambushed by Irish forces. And the men were killed or put to flight. And Elizabeth had to send a real army, 16,000 men, into Ireland. And people will grab from churches, from pubs, from theaters to go fight in Ireland. 1 out of every 50 English men in the late 1590s was shipped off to fight in Ireland. You did not want to fight in Ireland. People mutinied. They were not happy about it. So what does Shakespeare do? He writes a play called Henry V that is about sending an army into France. You couldn't get away with writing a play about sending an army into Ireland.
Yeah.
You couldn't even write or talk about the Irish campaign. It was so politically sensitive. But in the middle of Henry V, at the beginning of the fifth act, the chorus turns to the audience and starts speaking of the general of our gracious Empress, the Earl of Essex, our gracious Empress, Queen Elizabeth, from Ireland coming with rebellion broached on his sword. May he come home to London soon. They were hoping and praying that their brothers and sons and fathers and cousins would come home from Ireland victorious. So a play like Henry V that we see as some celebration of English nationalism was a play written in the midst of a very, very dirty, compromised war that ended unsuccessfully when that army was routed in late 1599. So again, what I'm interested in always in my work is holding Shakespeare's work up against his culture and seeing the way the time shaped the plays and the way the plays shaped the understanding of the times on the part of the audience. Because when you live through complicated moments, and I imagine in this country right now, you are living through a complicated moment, to whom do you turn? You turn to the media, you turn to television and radio and newspapers. But there's something about great theater that can explain things that other media cannot explain, that reaches into what people are feeling most deeply. And the best playwrights reach most deeply. And the reason Shakespeare is so great is not because he was for all time. He was only for all time because he was so much of his time.
Right. And you wrote that, was the St. Crispin's speech, he took it from a priest? Is it? What's the story
the
about?
whole notion of the very famous Henry V, once more into the breach, and then this day is called the Feast of Crispian. This is also connected to changing practices in England. When England was Catholic, there were saints' days, St. Crispin and other days, and those were celebrated. Henry V, the historical Henry V, never made such a speech on that day. And Shakespeare, in a way, is going back 100 years or 200 years to try to map onto his own culture its own stories and its own myths, and to rewrite the story. Shakespeare was never interested in making stories up. He was not imaginative in that way. Of the 36 or so plays that we have of his, maybe 2, The Tempest and Midsummer Night's Dream, are the only plays that he plotted himself. What he liked to do was take an old structure, like an old building, and do a gut renovation and rebuild it. He understood what others did poorly. He would see another company's play, and he'd say, I can take that story or an old play and bring it up to date And that's
Yeah.
what he does with the St.
And
Christmas.
what happened with the copyright then?
No copyright.
No copyright.
And when Shakespeare's works were published, he didn't make a penny.
The plays?
Now,
No, then the author, the editor, the
Yeah.
company.
it's not like the
Because it's like-
Borges estate fighting others
Yeah,
who can steal
yeah.
their materials. Authors had no rights to their work. Shakespeare did not own his own plays. His company owned his plays. And although he was a shareholder in his company, he was just 1/6 or
Yeah.
1/7. So he did not control them in that way. And when they were printed, the publishers made all the money from the plays. So Shakespeare made his money as a shareholder in a company and as part owner in his theaters. And he did very well in those ways, but everyday playwrights did not make a good living,
All right, so we're getting
unlike today.
we're getting into Hamlet, and there are like are there 6 previous versions of Hamlet, right? And how can you link them with the Shakespeare text?
At some point early in his career, Shakespeare was standing, given a bit role in a play also called Hamlet, a spear carrier, we call them in the theater. When you're not even allowed to speak lines, when you're not good enough, you just have to stand there and look important. And he's watching this play, I'm imagining this. He's watching this play of Hamlet. There are no soliloquies. The plot is not quite interesting enough. The language is dull. It's a revenge story. He understands
story,
people
yeah.
love revenge stories. And he says, I'm going to read every version of this. Saxo Grammaticus, I'm going to read Froissart's version of it. I'm going to read every version of this story. And then I'm going to rewrite it. And I'm going to add soliloquies. And I'm going to make this play speak to this moment in time brilliantly. And
So he started with like an imminent attack.
the play, interestingly,
Yeah.
starts with an attack from abroad. And this is right after the Armada threat. So I'm sure people in the playhouses are feeling a little nervous about it. It's a very topical play, but it's also a moment in time where new literary forms are being invented. Montaigne had been writing essays in France since 1580, 1581, when they were first published. They make their way into England, and people are beginning to write these essays of self-exploration. And Shakespeare figures out how to harness that and make it part of Hamlet's self-reflection. So he is just on the cusp of a moment where we are paying so much attention to interiority.
Yeah.
And this is the first great play. I mean, there are wonderful soliloquies, but brief ones in Julius Caesar, and even in a play like Richard III. But all of a sudden, we're entering into how not only somebody feels, but how somebody thinks, the very process of somebody thinking. And that is what is brilliant about Shakespeare's revision of Hamlet.
And there was a movement called melancholy or something. They were
Melancholy, you know,
melancholy.
Hamlet's a melancholy Dane. Shakespeare also understands depression. And depression was rife then, depression is rife now. Melancholy is until the mid-20th century, melancholy was a medical term that had not really changed from Shakespeare's day, that described a profound or serious depression. And Shakespeare gives Hamlet that melancholy quality. He's dressed in black, he's in mourning, he can't get over his father's death, and it's also an extraordinary portrait of a depressed young man. So in a lot of ways, Shakespeare's taking a very familiar story, but putting in it many, many unfamiliar elements in a way that no one had ever done before.
Yeah. Some link the name with the name of his boy. But there's a very interesting point of view that you wrote about Burbage and his dead father, you know, he being Hamlet and performing that
Yeah.
role with
Shakespeare's son had died about 4 years before he wrote Hamlet, and his son was named Hamlet. Hamlet were almost the same. And the question is, did Shakespeare write this as a tribute to his dead son? Or did Shakespeare write this play as a tribute both to his dead son and his dead father, since the play begins with the ghost of Hamlet's father coming back from the grave to speak to him? Sigmund Freud was so convinced that this was the case that he created something called the Oedipal theory, not based on Sophocles' Oedipus, but based on Shakespeare's Hamlet, because he felt so profoundly that this play could only have been written by somebody wrestling with these very issues. Do I think Shakespeare wrote Hamlet because of the death of his son Hamlet? I don't know. For all I know, Shakespeare, as an actor living in London with his son living 3 days away in Stratford, might have seen his son 5 times before he died from the time he was born. We like to romanticize Shakespeare and think he was a great father and caring, but he couldn't be in 2 places at the same time. Yeah. And I know enough actors to know that not all of them are devoted parents, even as they are devoted to their craft. It's very hard to be both. So as tempting as it is to think of this as an elegy for his son, we just don't know.
All right. Bueno, nos hicieron señales con las luces como para hacer el primer corte, así que tenemos 10, 15 minutos como mucho y nos volvemos a encontrar. Anoten las preguntas que quieran hacer, así después se las hacemos. Gracias.
Gracias. Thank you so much. Beautiful.